About 5 years ago, we moved into our small but comfortable home, searching for a quiet spot to raise our two children, Max and Lily. Everything appeared to be flawless. The park was only a short stroll away, the neighborhood was pleasant, and the street was lined with old oak trees. For our family, it was the perfect location. Mr. Charles, our neighbor next door, was a bit of a weirdo. He was an old man living alone in a big rundown house. He was a recluse who hardly talked to anyone and whose yard was a weed patch. I used to see him looking out from behind his curtains, sternly observing the street. I assumed it was just an elderly man's eccentricities from too much time spent alone. I was playing in our backyard with Lily and Max one lovely day when I saw a flash coming from Mr. Charles's upper window. It happened really fast, like a flash from a camera. I dismissed it with a shrug, assuming it was simply the light in his room bouncing off of anything. However, it then transpired once more. I was positive it was a camera this time. Mr. Charles was photographing us. A shiver went through my body. After bringing the youngsters closer, I guided them inside. I kept my ideas to myself so as not to frighten them. However, as the days passed, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy sensation I had. Mr. Charles was obviously observing us all the time until I started to pay more attention. His gaze followed us everywhere, in the yard, on the porch, or even just strolling to the car. I made the decision to discuss it with my husband Tom one evening. After the kids went to bed, we sat at the kitchen table and I told him everything. At first, Tom was dubious, believing me to be too paranoid, but he decided to watch Mr. Charles as well after noticing the horror in my eyes. Tom and I took turns babysitting the house the next day. Tom was quick to pick up on the same uncomfortable behavior. It's true that Mr. Charles was shooting images. He didn't even attempt to cover up the fact that he was using a long lens camera. Every time we were outdoors, he snapped away with it aimed right at our house. Tom made up his mind to speak with Mr. Charles. He strode to the ancient home and loudly knocked on the door. A short while later, the door cracked open, revealing Mr. Charles standing there, gaunt and bewildered. Tom insisted on knowing why he was photographing our family. Mr. Charles said nothing, only staring at him. At last, he blurted out something about how much he enjoyed taking pictures and slammed the door in Tom's face. I had trouble sleeping that night. I couldn't stop thinking of all the awful motives for why someone might snap photos of our children. Anger and terror surged through my head. And supposing he was a predator, what if he was up to something really bad? The toughest thing was not knowing. We phoned the cops in the morning. When the two cops got to our residence, we gave them the rundown on everything. They pledged to investigate and appeared worried. They visited Mr. Charles's residence and had a lengthy conversation with him. Upon their return, they confirmed that Mr. Charles had been snapping photos, but they were unable to locate any proof of a crime. They told us to monitor the issue and to give them a call if anything else came up. Weeks passed and the unsettling behavior persisted. My pulse raced in my chest each time I saw that flash from the camera. I felt confined within my own house. I even started keeping the drapes drawn, and we stopped letting the kids play outside. I didn't know what else to do, yet that was no way to live. I decided to use our old photo books as a diversion one day. I came upon an image of Lily and Max in the park as I turned the pages. However, something wasn't right. I could see Mr. Charles observing them from a bench in the background. I could feel my hands shaking as I realized he had been observing us for far longer than we had assumed. That was the last straw. We gave the cops another call and showed them the picture. They treated it more seriously this time. They obtained a warrant and looked into Mr. Charles's home. It was terrifying what they found. There were hundreds of pictures of our family in his attic, photos of us sitting on the porch, of Lily and Max playing in the yard, and even of us looking out our windows. When Mr. Charles was taken into custody, he remained silent and offered no explanation. Officers were perplexed. There was no proof that he had injured anyone or intended to. It seemed as though he had an irrational obsession with our family. We were rattled by the whole experience. In an attempt to escape the horror, we relocated to a new neighborhood. However, the worry persists. Mr. Charles and his quiet fixation come to mind whenever I notice a flash of light or get the impression that someone is observing us. We never learned why he carried it out. His goals remain a mystery to this day. All I know is that we were fortunate to apprehend him prior to any more serious events. I also hope that wherever he is at the moment, he isn't observing anyone else the same way he did us. I was living in a quiet little town in 2022 with my husband and our dog, Buddy. Buddy enjoyed romping about in our spacious backyard, which was part of our nice home. We have always felt secure in our community. It was the type of place where folks seldom ever closed their doors and everyone knew each other. Something weird happened on a cold October night. On a Tuesday, the moon was full in the sky and threw lengthy shadows across our garden. I had just gotten comfortable on the couch with my spouse to watch a movie. Our big, watchful German shepherd, Buddy, was sleeping at our feet, his ears twitching every now and again. Buddy's head shot up around midnight, right as the movie was about to get very fantastic. His throat was rumbling with a deep growl, and his ears were wide open. My spouse and I looked at each other anxiously. Buddy didn't growl until something wasn't right. "Boy, what's wrong?" I questioned while gently patting him to attempt to soothe him. However, Buddy had already stood up, his snarl becoming more intense. He made his way to the rear entrance. His tight body gazed out into our backyard's darkness. My spouse turned down the TV and we both paid close attention. The only sound at first was that of crickets chirping. Subtly, I perceived a sound like someone rummaging through the undergrowth. My heart began to pound. At this hour, who could be out there? Buddy started barking hysterically, sending his deep, booming barks resonating into the darkness. After grabbing a flashlight, my husband backed up to the rear entrance. He whispered to me, barely heard above Buddy's barking, "Stay here." With a gradual open, he let Buddy out, and he went toward the rear gate, snarling and barking. My spouse was shining the spotlight around the yard, and I was watching nervously from the doorway. The light beam moved through the woods and shrubs, but no one was visible. Buddy eventually stopped barking and came back into the house, alert as ever. With a pallid expression, my husband shut and locked the door. He responded, "We ought to inspect the gate. There's a problem." We walked outdoors in the morning to check the yard. My stomach dropped as I saw what was approaching the back gate. The gate's latch was broken, and the metal had twisted and bowed. It was obvious that someone had attempted to break in. A shiver went down my spine. Anyone interested in breaking into our yard? And why? My spouse made the decision to see the CCTV camera tape later that day. Though we had installed it for further protection a few months ago, we had never had to verify it until now. We took a seat at the computer and watched the previous night's film. Everything appeared normal at first. Buddy was sleeping on the porch and there was silence in the yard. Then, at midnight, we noticed someone approaching the rear gate. The individual was obscured by a hood and dark clothing, making it hard to see their face. Before they broke the gate, they walked up to it and played about with the lock for a few minutes. Buddy abruptly sprung to his feet and began barking as the man approached the home. After a brief period of hesitation, the intruder turned and fled in the direction of the gate. The hood lifted, showing their face for a split second just before they vanished from sight. My spouse let out a collective gasp. It was Mr. Thompson, our neighbor. He had always seemed a little strange to us, but we had no idea he was capable of such things. He was a recluse who seldom talked to anyone in the area. He lived alone. We were unsure of what to do. Do we have to face him? Make a police call? We made the decision to initially inquire about any unusual activity among our other neighbors. We discovered over the course of the following several days that we weren't the only ones who had encountered strange happenings. One morning, Mrs. Henry, a neighbor, discovered her garden gate unlocked, and Mr. Patel had seen footsteps close to his shed. Our small town's tranquil environment had been destroyed, and everyone was on edge. In the end, we chose to call the police and report the event. They visited our home, looked over the CCTV footage, and spoke with both our neighbors and ourselves. They pledged to look into it and to watch Mr. Thompson closely. A few days later, Mr. Thompson's home was visited by the police. He refuted everything they asked him. Without hard data, they had few options for action. They did, however, warn us to be watchful and to give them a call right away if anything untoward occurred. After several weeks, everything gradually went back to normal. We added more lights to the yard and changed the latch on the rear gate. Buddy was more protective than ever, as if he sensed our fear. Buddy started growling one night, right when I thought I was starting to feel comfortable again. I waited for any sounds outside, my heart pounding. Grabbing the flashlight, my spouse peered through the glass. Mr. Thompson stood there, close to the rear gate, the moonlight illuminating his features. He was still. My spouse saw that Mr. Thompson was staring at our house, so he phoned the police. A little while later, they showed up and took Mr. Thompson away to be questioned. This time, they discovered sufficient proof to connect him to many neighborhood break-ins. The community exhaled in unison upon his arrest and subsequent charges. The event had a profound effect on us. Although we had always felt secure in our small village, we soon discovered that danger may appear anywhere. From that point forward, we were more alert of our surroundings and exercised greater caution. And Buddy, our devoted guardian, never stopped watching out for us and prepared to defend us against any danger. If this is your first visit, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell symbol for forthcoming terrifying stories before we go on to the next story. Please tell your friends and family about these tales. We need their support. Regards. Nothing much happens in the little peaceful town where I reside. I'm Anna, and I attend a university. My tiny apartment is rented on the third floor of a historic structure. My modest home is pleasant and old, and I enjoy it. Mrs. Harper is an older woman who lives next to my flat. Mrs. Harper is somewhat peculiar. Whenever I come or depart, she always looks at me. She never grins, yet her eyes follow me. Even though it unnerves me, I attempt to ignore it. I was studying late one night for a test. I heard a knock on my door at approximately midnight. I was taken aback since I had never had visitors that late. I approached the door and poked my head through the spy hole. It was Mrs. Harper. Her terrified eyes were wide. I cautiously opened the door. "Sure," I said, attempting to maintain a steady tone. She murmured, "Someone is breaking into your house." She peered over her shoulder as if she was terrified someone was following her, and her voice quivered. My heart began to pound. "How come? Are you certain?" She repeated, "Yes, I saw someone climbing through your window. I should bring you along. The cops must be called." Despite my fear, I nodded and reached for my phone. Mrs. Harper showed me how to get to her apartment down the hall. After telling the operator what Mrs. Harper had stated, I called 911. I was instructed by the operator to wait for the cops by staying on the line. I sat in Mrs. Harper's living room with her. Her flat had a musty old book scent about it. I made an effort to relax, but the idea of someone being in my flat kept coming back to me. A few minutes later, Mrs. Harper got to her feet. She responded, "I think I heard something. We ought to give your flat a look." Although I felt compelled to attend, I didn't want to. I trailed after Mrs. Harper as she headed back to my flat. The door was ajar when we arrived. I gulped. I felt a shiver go down my spine as I said, "I locked it before I left." Mrs. Harper gave a nod. She said, "Stay behind me." With my heart racing, I followed her inside the apartment. It was quiet and dark in the flat. We entered the bedroom after passing via the living room. It was when I switched on the light that I noticed him. A guy was looking through my belongings while he stood by my dresser. He turned to face us, his eyes icy. I froze with terror. Mrs. Harper failed to do so. She grinned. "Well done, Tony," she told the man. My stomach fell out. "What is happening?" Shaking, my voice questioned. Tony moved in my direction. He responded, "Just keep quiet and you won't get hurt." Mrs. Harper took hold of my arm. Her grasp was very firm considering her advanced age. She added, "All we want is your valuables. After you give us your cash and jewels, we'll depart." I followed their instructions despite my fear. I handed over my watch, wallet, and the little jewelry items I had. Tony packed it all into a sack. Mrs. Harper gave me another smile after they had removed everything. "I'm grateful, sweetie." They bid me good night and drove off. I was stunned and couldn't believe what had occurred. I informed the cops of everything when I phoned them again. Though they arrived swiftly, Tony and Mrs. Harper had already left. The building and my unit were searched by the cops. Mrs. Harper and the guy who had robbed me were nowhere to be seen. They appeared to have disappeared into thin air. Although the police assured me they would continue searching, I could see by the expression in their eyes that they were losing hope. That night I had trouble sleeping. I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Harper and her deception of me. I felt so stupid and afraid. I went to my landlord the next day and told him everything. Startled, he pledged to assist me in locating a new flat. I made as swift an exit from the building as I could. Even though I never saw Tony or Mrs. Harper again, I can't shake the memories of that evening. My pulse accelerates and I get a shiver every time I hear someone knock on my door. I've become better at exercising caution and trusting my gut. Something is most likely incorrect if it feels off. and I shall always remember Mrs. Harper's odd, fixed gaze and the evening when she terrorized me.